at Southampton University. I'm John Denham and I'm the director of the centre. Today we're going to look at whether and how England's voters may influence the UK's foreign policy. England is, of course, the largest part of the United Kingdom, so it's always going to have a heavy influence. But there's more to it than that. In the Brexit decision, the most far-reaching change in our foreign policy since the decision to join the EU, the contested worldviews of English voters played a major part. Those who emphasised their English identity voted heavily Leave, and British identifiers voted largely for Remain. And tonight our speakers, Professor Srdjan Vucetic from Ottowa University and Tim Oliver from Loughborough, will discuss whether similarly contested views about the UK's place in the world could influence future foreign policy. And by the way, at this point, I want to apologise for those who are also hoping to hear Helene von Bismarck. Helene's had to drop out for family reasons, but we will miss her particular perspective on British foreign policy. Now, just to let you know what's going to happen, to open the discussion, I'm going to present some recent polling data commissioned by Southampton and Loughborough universities. Srdjan, who is the author of Greatness and Decline, National Identity and British Foreign Policy, will then follow that up and discuss the formation of foreign policy. And Tim, who's the author of Understanding Brexit, will respond and suggest areas for further exploration. Just some housekeeping. We are recording the webinar and it will go up on YouTube in due course. The Zoom call has a question and answer, a Q&A function. So if you would like to pose a question, please use that. I will put your questions later on rather than invite people in individually. And you are also welcome to use the chat function. I'll try and monitor that, but I can't promise to pick up questions posted there. So if you want to have the best chance of getting your question answered, please use the Q&A function. So with that opening, let me just try and share screen, at which point things usually go wrong, but I'll try and share the screen and go through some of the data that we got back really in the last 10 days, 10 to 14 days. So we surveyed 1,400 English adults with YouGov. For some reason, my screen is not moving. Let's turn the pointer off. The first question, sorry, apologies for that. The first question we asked, and there are a series of 3 questions, we asked about geopolitical relationships, and we asked the respondents to say between 1 and 5 how important the UK's relationships were with, as you can see there, the USA, the EU, the Commonwealth, Australia, China, and India. In order to analyse the data, in a simple way for tonight, we focused on those propositions that were most strongly supported, so the most strongly held views, and we plotted the proposition by national identity. We plotted it by each national identity, by the proposition. We looked at the same data by the Leave Remain vote in 2016, and then by the English not British and the British not English groups, 2 small groups at either end of the Merino scale. So if we look at how that worked out for geopolitical relationships, we can see here around the outside the different places with which we have relationships, and inside how those fell out by different national identities. So most groups, though there's some spread, prioritize the USA, but we can see there's a big divergence between the more English groups and the more British groups over the importance of relationships with the EU. Relationships with the Commonwealth were broadly clustered together, and even more so with Australia, but some signs of divergence when it comes to the importance of India and China. So when you look at how the different national identity groups work by the geography, two things I think become quite clear. Firstly, it's the more British groups that prioritized the EU, and it's the more English groups that gave lowest priority to the EU. And all the different national identity groups gave lower priorities to relationships with China and India than the other groups. When we look at this by leave and remain, the differences are really quite stark. Here we can see that the leave group is much more linked towards the Commonwealth and away from the EU and away from China and India, where the remain group has the more global perspectives on our relationships. There's little difference with the British English group, so I won't go on to those. So on the relationships, the greatest divergence is on the importance of the relationships with the EU. The English identities lean towards the Anglosphere and away from the EU, the British identities towards the EU, and to a lesser extent, India and China. The leave-remain divide gives the sharpest divergence between Anglospheric and broader global relationships, and India and China are given less importance by all identity groups. So then went on to defence, where we looked at 4 options, and again, 1 to 5 in terms of closeness to people's views. Deploying our armed forces to support democracy and human rights, liberal interventionism, if you like. Using our armed forces to support military alliances. Only deploying our armed forces where the UK is directly threatened. And overseas aid as a better way of promoting the UK's interests and values than military action. Some quite stark differences in shapes between the lozenges here. A big polarization on the value of aid, and quite a big polarization on the importance to deploying our military only to defend ourselves. Some divergence on democracy and alliances, but if we look at the next screen, we can see quite clearly it's the English groups that give the greatest support to prioritizing threats to the UK, and the British orientated groups that give the greatest support to or greatest importance to aid. On leave and remain, you can see quite clearly it's even starker, with the remain groups giving the biggest priority to aid and the leave groups the biggest priority to threat. Perhaps what I should have said on an earlier slide is that all of the groups give the lowest priority to defending human rights and democracy when it comes to the use of our military. So the greatest polarization on aid versus threat, fewer differences on alliances and democracy, all identities giving less importance to human rights and democracy than other military or aid priority. Leave, remain, and English-British follow similar patterns. So to go to the final group of data, we looked at 4 options for trade and economic policy: reducing trade barriers with the EU, reducing trade barriers with the rest of the world, ensuring that our national economy is more resilient against global events, and ensuring that prioritizing preventing foreign companies owning British businesses and public services. The divergences again, well, these are quite interesting figures, I think. Firstly, there's a real clustering of support and a very high priority for national economic resilience. The bigger differences are how much priority should be attached to reducing EU trade barriers, less difference when it comes to global trade barriers, and some quite strong support for protecting national ownership. If we look at those issues by national identity, you again begin to see that it's the English groups that put somewhat higher priority onto national ownership, and it's the British groups that put the higher priority onto reducing EU trade barriers. When you look at the Leave Remain groups, you can, I think, see again that same stark divergence, with the Leave group being more in favor of protecting national ownership, and the Remain group more in favor of reducing EU trade barriers, but again, a lot of convergence around national resilience. So I'm just going to, something went back wrong with the presentation there, so I'm just going to flick back. So that's where I hope we'd got to, and you can see on that there the skewing towards national ownership amongst the Leave group, and the skewing towards the importance of reducing EU trade barriers amongst the Remain group.
Your screen isn't showing.
Oh, so I'm sorry about that. Right, thank you. Thanks for pointing that out, Tim. Never let amateurs do these things themselves. So the final point there is, you could see on the, hopefully you will see very shortly, on trade, the point that I was making, you probably heard me say it several times now, is that the Leave groups are the ones that prioritize national ownership, and the Remain voters are the ones that prioritize reducing EU trade barriers. Very high levels of support for national resilience. So just a commentary on this, the highest priority is on national resilience for all identities. British identities lean towards the EU, English identities towards national ownership, as with Leave and Remain. Reducing global trade barriers gets consistent but lower levels of priority. The Leave, Remain and British diverge on ownership and EU trade, but not on resilience and global trade. So as a quick summary, different national identities in England do hold different worldviews. They're matched, and even more strongly, by Leave and Remain voters. That's not a surprise, I think, because it was Leave and Remain that forced people's worldviews into a binary choice. Not everybody who identified strongly as English voted Leave, not everybody who identified strongly as British voted Remain. But these are clearly quite polarized worldviews. The more English tend to give lower priority to all international relations, prioritize the Anglosphere, have a narrower defense posture, give less importance to aid, and want to protect national ownership. The more British differ in the other direction. There's significant convergence between the national identity groups on the priority for relations with the USA, Australia, and the Commonwealth. All groups give lower importance to India and China. The promotion of democracy and human rights is least important to all groups, and national resilience is the most important economic issue. So do contested worldviews matter? Well, three possibilities. One, if posed as a sharp political choice, and this is hard to predict because you have to have political parties that mobilize these groups, as well as the groups having different opinions, which of course is what UKIP did successfully in the early years of this century around English Euroscepticism. Somewhere in this data, perhaps, is the suggestion that around issues of aid, the current demands from COP for funding for impact and damage, against the idea of a more narrowly nationalist military outlook, the possibility of long-term expensive aid for Ukraine, you can begin to see how a political difference might get mobilized. The second possibility is if these views constrain or support foreign policy. If you look at this data, which is admittedly quite crude, it's difficult to see a huge base of support for sending our only working aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Straits to defend human rights and democracy. On the other hand, if the reports are true that Rishi Sunak wants to take a more skeptical view about Chinese ownership and investment in our economy or infrastructure, there seems to be a large basis of support for that sort of action. And the third area where we have no data here, but it's an interesting one to think about, is if these different worldviews clash with other UK nations. Political parties fighting elections in England take it for granted that you have to support a unilateral nuclear deterrent. The SNP has won in Scotland for many years whilst advocating a nuclear-free Scotland. So maybe at some point, these views in England exacerbate divergence with other UK nations. Well, I hope that's a useful overview of the data, and I'm now going to pass to Srdjan and ask him to follow with his own slides, which I hope he'll manipulate much more successfully than I did with mine. Srdjan. You are muted. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'll probably have a new share here. Let's see what happens. All right. Do you see the map of your country here? All right. So first of all, I'm very grateful to be here. A big thanks to John and Tim for inviting me. I want to talk briefly to you first about the findings of this unique survey, and then maybe I'll say a few words about theories of UK foreign policies and how survey research of this kind can be used productively in scholarship. First of all, I think John and Tim should be applauded and be given more funds for this kind of work. Survey research on English views of the UK's role in relationships in the world is important, but curiously understudied. And I find that curious also in relative terms. On Thursday here at the University of Ottawa, we're hosting a panel on Scotland in a changing world order with 3 members of the newly founded Scottish Council on Global Affairs. And I did a little bit of quick internet-based research to see, do we have survey and non-survey research on Scotland/Scottish views and UK foreign policy? Turns out we do. In Canada, which is also a multi-level, multinational state, there's a lot more research on this theme, meaning there are surveys showing similarities and differences between Quebec and the rest of Canada, between different provinces in the so-called rest of Canada. So I'm actually part of some of this research production myself. 2 years ago, we did a very similar survey looking at sort of a national sample and 1,400 Canadians on very similar questions. So if we have time, maybe we'll get to some cross-national comparison here. So yes, I find it curious that we're now in a post-Brexit period, if you like, and yet there is still a shortage of data on this topic. So by way of discussion, I want to turn to the findings of this project by talking about their similarities and differences, mostly similarities with 3 recent books, which I like. Book 1 is English Nationalism, Brexit and the Anglosphere by Ben Wellings. Book 2 is Englishness, the Political Force Transforming Britain by Elsa Henderson and Richard Wynne-Jones. And book 3 is my own foreign policy book, John mentioned earlier, and I'll plug it shamelessly in this discussion with some apologies. So the Welling books, the Wellings book makes a convincing argument that Brexit should not be viewed as an expression of parochial Little Englandism, but rather as an elite project that attempted to replace the European Union with trade and security alliances within the so-called Anglosphere. So this word keeps coming up already, and it's a relatively new word, entered the Oxford English Dictionary in 2007, was coined in 1995, so it's a neologism. But this idea of a commitment to this thing we call the Anglosphere seems borne out by John and Tim's data. This is the part where those more English respondents tend to go in their imaginations. So what is this thing, the Anglosphere? Well, it's a group of English-speaking countries that are said to share some traits and behaviors, values, identities, interests, ideologies, habits, and so on. The maps of the Anglosphere vary. This one is from an Italian foreign policy magazine. It gives 2 categories: red, states where English is the language of the majority or an official language, and orange where English is an official language, but not the most used language, so to speak. And there's also clearly something marked that says Five Eyes, the name that comes from the Cold War era practice of sharing intelligence via secret classification. So Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, UK, US eyes only, Five Eyes only. These five are often referred to as the Anglosphere core. Take this with a grain of salt or with quotation marks. The core of that core is the UK-US axis, or the so-called UK-US special relationship. So when research shows that the English give priority to relations with the USA, Australia, and the Commonwealth, this order, I would argue, is very important, and I'll perhaps come back in the Q&A. For now, I want to mention book number 2, Englishness by Henderson and Wynne Jones. And these authors have co-directed the Future of England survey since 2011 and the Four Nation State of the Union survey since 2018. So they have a very large set of very useful data on attitudes to the Union, national identity, economic and social solidarity, as well as some preferences about foreign policy or foreign policy orientations, rather. At one point in the book, they have this metaphor of England and Englishness. This is rooted in their analysis, both data and analysis, as the high wall keep at the center of concentric circles of belonging. And I'm trying to paraphrase this as closely as I can. Britain is the inner curtain wall. The outer wall is the Anglosphere, meaning what I just described, the core Anglosphere states specifically, so old dominions plus the US. And beyond that lies a moat separating those who belong from those who do not. So I did a little bit of artwork myself here, and this is I think a very useful metaphor to think some of this data through, or think about this data, if you like. Now, something like this is also one of the main findings in a decidedly non-survey research. So this commitment to the Anglosphere, and metaphorically, you can express in England as a keep, surrounded by 2 sets of walls plus a moat. You don't have to read my book. You can actually read an article version that appeared in International Affairs earlier this year under the title Elite Mass Agreement in British Foreign Policy. The data comes from something called Making Identity Count Project, which was an attempt to go beyond surveys and studying national identity. You can find more about this on this website, which I'm actually maintaining these days. And you can simply Google it. I'm not going to share with you in the chat the link to it. But essentially, if you look at the matrix below, it suggests that research on national identity cuts across 3, I'm sorry to use the word ontological categories: objective, subjective, intersubjective, or theories of reality, as well as between pre-theorized versus inductive categories, so empirical categories. So most of us political science, most of the time use surveys and survey experiments and so on. But sometimes if you want to try interpretive work, proper interpretive work, and in I guess UK political science, many will know the work by Mark Bevier and Rod Rhodes. They did some fantastic work on British governance from an interpretivist tradition. Well, there's an interpretivist tradition in UK foreign policy studies as well. And in this case, your typical methodology is either ethnography or discourse analysis. And what we did in this project is study the evolution of major power national identity since 1950s using inductive discourse analysis. And we did so by analyzing elite and mass texts that can be credibly described as high circulating in a given year. So my interest, personal interest was, and professional interest was, it was Britain and Britishness, or England and Englishness, from 1950 to 2000. So my analysis stops in 2000. I did an update to 2015, the year before the Brexit vote. But essentially, the goal was to try and capture the so-called overheard conversations in randomly selected texts, but that are nonetheless best-selling, most viewed, most watched, most talked about in a given year. And so this analysis privileged England, more specifically London, as the dominant site of discursive production of this thing we call Britain, or more accurately, a polity historian David Edgerton calls national UK. I'm not going to try to convince you that this particular method of reading Britishness is the best thing since Britain won the World Cup, but I do want to put it out there as a reminder that mass public opinion can be and perhaps should be studied in more ways than one. So what did this research discover? For one thing, in the early years, everyone tended to conflate Britain, meaning England, Wales, and Scotland, and even the United Kingdom, meaning Britain plus Northern Ireland, with England. And so this became common. So I'm talking about both elite texts and mass texts, everything from, blockbuster movies and best-selling novels all the way to, speeches given by prime ministers at their party conferences in a given year. So this became less common after 1970. So think of Scottish devolution referendum, and especially after the actual revolution under New Labour. Next, the idea of global leadership, whether by trade or diplomacy, was always salient from the Attlee years onwards. And there was always an emphasis on hard power among these various, expressions of leadership. So that perhaps is a point of interest to me, because it kind of complicates some of my priors about what the English traditionally thought. Again, this research is historical, not post-Brexit, as in the case of Tim and John's work. Also, there was a commitment or certain imagination that the British self extended to the so-called English-speaking world. It comes from Churchill, English-speaking world. And here, there was clarity that the English-speaking world was, first of all, the old Commonwealth, secondly, the new Commonwealth. So India, for example, was rarely a top 10 significant category in one of these national identity reports for the UK. China barely showed up. So this is consistent with some of the findings. And this was actually what John and Tim did in this project. Their findings reminded me of that by David Sanders and Geoffrey Edwards. In 1994, they had a wonderful study based on elite interviews. So Whitehall, Westminster, Fleet Street. And one of the findings says that generally the elites were more interested in the peoples of the former Soviet Union than the peoples of the new Commonwealth, which is really interesting, right? And perhaps it's coming back with Ukraine, the Ukraine effect. It's being borne out by the data. So what's puzzling me here, as I said earlier, is this notion that the English, or those who identify as more English, imagine that Britain needs a narrow defense posture. So I'm not surprised about mass level support to the idea of smaller official development assistance. The UK was always more generous on this file than, let's say, Canada. I'm also not terribly surprised about the idea of protecting national ownership. But smaller military, let alone a military focus on the defense of the Isles or even just Britain, I find that strange. But it's interesting. It complicates also some of my understanding what I think are Lexit views of UK foreign policy, which I still think are fringe. We can maybe talk about that in the Q&A. Yes to national ownership, yes to foreign aid reduction, and narrow defense posture, but what does that mean exactly? Giving up Trident or one of the super carriers? I'm not quite sure. But there's I think a disagreement about this connection to the Anglosphere, in as much as it means the UK-US special relationship. So I guess this is a call for more research on this topic. Now, I think I have a little bit of time to talk about just theoretically what does this sort of research mean for theories of UK foreign policy. And I think it's safe to say that without attending to the question of how elites relate to each other, ruling elites to sub-elites, as well as elites in general to mass public, we miss very important sources of state action. And I think this, in the UK case, means studying the constituent nations very closely, which is exactly what this project is doing. We should also say that the interactions between elites and masses have changed over time in response to both institutional changes and shifts in the political environment. And these changes help explain why elites frequently don't get what they want, even when they have strong preferences. Conversely, what the public wants may well be a function of cultural hegemony, which is, I guess, a concept that I borrowed from British left thought, and they borrowed it from Gramsci. But anyway, in the book, I kind of talk about that briefly. But the infrastructures that elites use to maintain this hegemony are very interesting, an interesting topic to study. And that actually includes public opinion research as well. And I don't want to go so far to say that public opinion it creates social phenomena. Maybe I'll say it in the Q&A. But it is affected by, one, political campaigns to shape public opinion, and two, the existing environment or the distribution of elite attitudes, especially when they're polarized or depending on the degree of independence in the media. In 2017, this is the fourth book I'll mention, James Strong at LSE had a volume called Public Opinion Legitimacy in Tony Blair's War, and I think we need more of that sort of work. And so similarly, if attitudes about politicians dominate political opinion, then position taking or flip-flopping may not matter. And we've seen this in the US case many times, but I imagine it'll be the case in the UK under the current government. In short, we know that elites play a key role in providing cues and information to the public, and that's reflected, I guess, in the explosion of survey and laboratory experiments on foreign policy, especially in the US context, or done by US-based scholars. But there are other ways to study the so-called elite public gaps and agreements and disagreements, and they may not be as big as we previously thought, which is of course where this type of research comes in. And I'll stop here and give a chance to Tim to expand on further research areas. Thank you.
Srdjan, thank you very much indeed. Just before I bring Tim in, could I just remind people, please do pose questions or use the chat, because I can no doubt keep the webinar going for a bit after our speakers by posing my own questions, but it'd be really nice to be able to take ones that you yourselves have put in. Srdjan's raised some really interesting things there about how we study these things, but also what the data is saying, and some areas where the data may be a surprise compared with some of the assumptions we might have made about public views. But I'm going to go to Tim now, but with that encouragement to you all to pose some questions in the Q&A. Tim.
Thank you, John. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Good, excellent. I don't have any PowerPoint, which is unusual. Usually I subject my my audience to not lots of text, but lots of images. So instead, you're just going to have to look at me tonight in a rather bleak, cold London. Thank you to Srdjan and to John for those comments and observations. I'll make my comments brief, therefore, and I'm just going to comment on three things. First of all, why this is important. Second, some of my own observations about the data that John and I, through YouGov, were able to present to you today, and one or two little extra insights that I think are interesting and open up lots of other questions. And then finally, some questions about for further development. Where does this go next? Because clearly this isn't going away. England is not going to disappear as a question, the English question. It's going to grow, if anything. And I suppose, therefore, starting with why this is important, I can't help but think back to the first time that I presented on Brexit, which I've been working on for almost a decade now, long before the referendum was called. Now, I won a chance to present on what Brexit would mean for the European Union. This is where I started. I was working in Berlin back in 2012 when David Cameron committed to an EU referendum. And I presented on what a British exit for the EU, a British exit from the EU could mean for the EU. And at the end, my discussants, all they wanted to discuss was Scotland. And I kind of sighed, I was like, okay, yes, we can discuss Scottish independence as a result of a British exit and so forth. But I then pushed back saying, what about England? Are you going to talk about England here in terms of what it means for England to leave the European Union, England still to be outside the EU? England doesn't pick itself up and move off to the South China Sea or off the east coast of the United States. It's still going to be there. And in reply, my discussants carried on discussing Scotland because they were more comfortable. They knew more about Scotland. England was this big unknown. They knew it mattered, but how to break down England, how to understand England without talking about the UK was something that they didn't really kind of have much of a grip on. Now that has improved. Things have changed over the last 10 years. People are certainly more aware of what England means, but I still think there's a big gap, not only in our understanding within the UK of England, but also outside of the UK. I don't think it would come as a surprise to anybody on the call who is from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to be frustrated when they travel abroad and are told, oh, you come from England. No, I come from Scotland, but, you know, okay, fine, you think England and the UK are the same. There's still that conflation much strongly outside the UK than even within England. As Srdjan pointed out, there is also the tension about elite views here versus kind of more popular views, and to what extent popular views actually work their way through to actually engaging elite views, to what extent popular views shape the way that decisions are made, and whether or not that matters, whether the elite and their views and the narratives that they hold are actually the more important things rather than studying public opinion. But okay, to some extent, maybe the English have always thought like this. The one thing that we don't have, and this is something we'll come back to a little later, is that we don't really have a lot of data going back decades on this. It's something that Henderson and Wynne-Jones point out, that really until 20 years ago, pollsters weren't really breaking it down by England, Scotland, and so forth. So we've got a dearth of data here. So this is going to continue to grow. We're going to have more and more data on England, hopefully, but political science still tends to think more about UK, or at least I should add a caveat there. It's more Great Britain. Northern Ireland is often, one of the first rules of British politics is Northern Ireland is very strange, and we don't think about Northern Ireland, we leave it over there. And even YouGov, who the polling was done through, don't poll in Northern Ireland, they focus on Great Britain of England, Wales, and Scotland. So there's a question here about the time frame, about elite views, about the relevance of this. And I'm glad also that John and I decided that we'd include questions about the economy and economic openness, issues to do with globalization, because foreign policy, sometimes I find as somebody who crosses the IR politics divide in academia, I get frustrated sometimes when people in IR talk about foreign policy as if it's defense policy, if it's political positioning versus kind of China or Russia or Japan and so forth, and they overlook the international political economy, which is incredibly important, especially when it comes to Brexit. Brexit is about what type of political economy the UK wants, and we've not settled on that. The last few weeks, when the polling was conducted, it must be said, have been a rather topsy-turvy period for British political economy, given Liz Truss's failure with her Chancellor to try and create, from some people's perspective, a Singapore-on-Thames type economic model for the UK. And as we've seen, that created a backlash, which our polling doesn't really kind of, shows why this was going to happen. There was a bit of backlash. You should be protecting the country. You shouldn't be opening up to quite the same extent that maybe the Liz Truss agenda of a more Thatcherite, open, deregulated, low-tax Singapore-on-Thames economy would have pointed towards. So let me just quickly move on, just very briefly, about one or two little observations of my own about the data. As John and as Srdjan have both pointed out, this is about England that we've got data. We don't have data about Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. That is one of the gaps, and that's something that John and I hope to develop in future, and I know others would like to look at in order to understand, okay, what are actually Scottish views on the Anglosphere, for example, compared to English views? Are they actually that different? But if you look, the data we have does provide one important little breakdown geographically. We've looked at England, and the data provides a breakdown of the North, the Midlands, the South, and of course, London. Now, I don't want to dig too much into this because the numbers are quite low, but I don't think it comes as a surprise that on some issues, the one bit of England that stands out is, of course, London. We know that London voted Remain as a majority versus the rest of England, and you can see little differences of how people in London in this survey responded. First of all, it's not surprising that they might not have aligned with English views, given that the proportion of people in London who are identified as, let me just find it, other or non, when it came to identity, was 22%. So you've got just over a fifth of the people surveyed in London who didn't even want to identify as English, British, more British than English, and so forth. So you've got this big chunk of people in London, the home of the metropolitan elite, shall we say, to use a term that's often bandied around, who hold slightly different opinions to those that you find elsewhere in England. But again, you found views therefore in London that weren't actually that different to elsewhere. Londoners aren't that different in their views of the United States. to elsewhere, anywhere else in England. They have lower views, according to this data, of the Commonwealth, so less supportive of the Commonwealth, but much more supportive of the European Union, much more supportive of international aid. Not that much difference when it comes to economic policy with the rest of England, except when it comes to foreign ownership of companies. There's a bit of an ambivalence here. Actually, they're more open to foreign ownership of companies in the UK than elsewhere in England. So perhaps here you've got a hint here as to what we might find with Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, that London is a bit of a pointer in terms of you are going to find some differences, but not some big differences, apart from Brexit, which is still the dividing issue, still overhangs British politics, whether it's in England, Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. And also, the data also points to that other issue that divides British politics and has often defined British politics for so long, which is not necessarily regional identity or religion, it's class. And if you look in the data, you find that the ABC, the managers, the upper middle class and so forth, they tended to be much more pro-European than the lower kind of classes, manual labourers and so forth, who tended to be a bit more leaning towards the Commonwealth and Australia and so forth. But even there, you find a lot of similar views about China or India and so forth. So where does this go? Where do we go next in terms of questions? Well, first of all, the big question is, how does this compare to England? How does England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland compare? Also, what actual relevance does this have, as Srdjan touched on, to actually how policy making is made? The UK state remains very majoritarian, very unitary, very functional. It tends not to be very geographically orientated, especially within Whitehall and central British government. Are we going to see a change in that over the next 10 years, depending upon constitutional changes, whether it's a reformed House of Lords that suddenly has a regional identity to it, or some form of movement towards further federalism towards Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland? Or, and this is what I want to leave us on, what happens if we do start to see the breakup of the United Kingdom? If Scotland leaves, if Irish reunification happens, and we're left with an England and Wales, potentially England re-emerging, in question mark, from the UK, what are we going to have? What type of country are we going to be left with here? Is this going to be the successor state? The literature in IR on successor states often points to Russia as the example. But even Russia isn't necessarily a good example, because what happened in the early 1990s happened as a big collapse, and that's not necessarily going to happen in the UK's case. It might be quite progressive and slow. It's going to be positive. It's going to come through democratic votes and so forth. There's not going to be any fighting, at least we hope. There's not going to be any fighting. So perhaps actually what happens with the evolution of the UK in breaking up and in England re-emerging might actually be not quite in the same way as other successor states have emerged in the past. But there are still going to be quite bitter debates about debts, about the BBC, about defence policy, about Trident, about even the English support for an independent Scotland joining the EU or NATO, and will England make life difficult? I think Henderson and Wynne-Jones found some evidence in their polling that suggested that if Scotland leaves, the English become quite difficult in terms of negotiating with, or at least there's support for a difficult relationship with Scotland to say, well, tough, we're going to have to take a hard line here with you. And I'm reminded, therefore, going back to where I started on Brexit, there's been a lot of discussion about how to compare the UK's exit from the EU with a potential Scottish exit from the United Kingdom. Well, okay, but does that hint to also the fact that England, like the European Union, will take a very hard line in terms of, well, we're the bigger party here versus Scotland. You're going to have to play ball with us. England's actually going to have a bit of a kind of a much more forthright approach, just like the European Union did to some extent. But even there, the dynamics will be slightly different, depending on what the Scottish want to do, for example, with regard to EU membership and whether they've got the EU behind them, therefore pressuring on England. But if that happens, how are the English going to react? Does this create a more stronger backlash in England, as if here's the Scots, here's the Irish, here's the European Union ganging up on the English? Are we actually going to see an even stronger backlash by some who identify more as strongly English? And where does that leave more progressive, more pro-European views in England vis-a-vis England's place, therefore, with relations to Scotland, Ireland, and the European Union? And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Good questions for further discussion, further exploration. I'm going to go straight now to some of the questions that have been put in, and then perhaps throw some other things into discussion, and please encourage other people to put in questions. Can we go to one first from Max Dixon, which I'll just read out as it is, because it's very clear. Liz Truss briefly pushed for a considerable change to the UK's foreign policy approach to China, including officially declaring China as a, quote, threat. Max says it's unclear if Rishi Sunak will uphold this, but Srdjan, Tim, do you think from the data we've got here or your broader knowledge, there is public support for a more hawkish China policy and the potential trade implications this policy may have? Srdjan, can I go to you first? You muted, that's it.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. It's a question that all so-called liberal Western democracies are debating right now. I mean, in Canada, we have a similar doctrine being advanced by Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who's been advocating for more French shoring, as she put it, and sort of a common front of democracies against the threat of China. I think, first of all, with the word threat of Chinese threat or the threat of China, so the NATO strategic concept from 2022 does not go so far to name China as a threat. I mean, it's very clear on Russia, calling Russia and its invasion or reinvasion of Ukraine a threat to NATO and values that NATO says it stands for. But China is seen as a competitor, as a concern, and not quite a threat. So threat is the kind of diplomatic language you use on special occasions. Now, the question here is about the publics and the Truss attempt to configure China as threatening to the UK and its allies. I think is one option that various governments across the Western world have these days. But I also see a tremendous, I guess, turn on the opinions of China at the level of public opinion polls. If you look at, let's say, Pew Research, which is probably the gold standard because they've been doing this since 2000 or something, you see that 2000, well, essentially, a more aggressive China under Xi Jinping, so 2013-14, and then especially in the COVID era, has correlated with more negative views across the board everywhere, including in Asia, but also in places like the UK and Canada. Now, the big question is, what does that mean? What do governments or ruling elites are going to do with that information, right? We know that China is not as popular in our imaginations as it used to be, or not popular, but we're less tolerant of the idea that there's this competing system out there. And so what do we do if we're policymakers? Well, one option, I think, that's been maybe 120 years old, has always been to create a concept of democracies and to divide the world into the democratic and authoritarian camps and create some sort of a new Cold War. And I think that's been gaining ground lately. UK diplomacy has been at the forefront of, in putting this idea forward under the term D10, 10 democracies. But even before that, at the Toronto summit of G8, so we're talking about way earlier, Canadian diplomats have been advancing this idea as well. I think it's not yet gone completely mainstream because so much depends on what's going to happen in the US elections, as of this week, within 24 hours, and again in 2024, because the US takes the lead on these things and many of its allies follow one way or another. But I think the Truss views, even if, let's say, the Sunak government decides to tone down some of this rhetoric, this option is here to stay, and this policy option will be constantly debated and visited and revisited in every Western government, from the immediate neighbors of China to those that are, I guess, furthest away geographically.
Thanks. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, John. I suppose I've just got two quick observations. First, the one thing which we didn't poll on in this ask about in this opinion polling was immigration, and one of the biggest changes in immigration policy, or biggest group of immigrants over the last 10 years that has, I don't want to say gone unnoticed, but of course is the issue of Hong Kong. And we don't, I can't think of any data, I'm sure it must exist, that if you ask people in England or in the UK-wide, about their views of immigrants, what their views of immigrants from Hong Kong and the situation in Hong Kong is versus views of immigrants from Albania, to pick a controversial issue at the moment. So there's one area which we might dig into further in future in terms of views of China versus Hong Kong, for example. There's maybe a tension that you can tease out there. But then the second issue, I suppose, is the issue of the Anglosphere and the Commonwealth, which is, as we've seen, there are some tensions in English views, or British views in England, sorry, about relations with the Commonwealth, with Australia and so forth. Countries for whom the issue of China is a much more immediate, direct issue than it is for the United Kingdom. So it would be interesting, I suppose, in further polling, to dig into that views of those more positive views of the Commonwealth, about how far those views go. For example, are those who are in favour of closer links with the Commonwealth very supportive of the UK or England becoming supportive of Australia or Malaysia or Singapore in some form of tensions with China? Actually, how far are they prepared to allow this to go? So I'm throwing here out more questions than answers, but I suppose there are ways you could dig into this that the data points to in terms of tensions over the Commonwealth and the immigration question, which we've not really covered that much yet. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Tim. I mean, just a couple of points on the survey. Obviously, this is really an exploratory exercise to see, is there something here that's worth looking at in more detail? And that obviously meant that lots of things we don't necessarily know what people had in mind when they looked at the question. So it's quite striking, for example, that there's much higher priority given to relations with the Commonwealth than there is with India, which is the largest member of the Commonwealth, which implies, and I think we're reading it to mean, that this probably means a view of the white Commonwealth, or largely white Commonwealth, as opposed to the whole of the Commonwealth. We don't actually know that on the basis of this. And I think it's similar with the immigration issue, where we know the polls are completely contradictory, that public worries about immigration overall are at their lowest levels for many, many years and way down from Brexit. On the other hand, on the specific issue of small boats crossing the Channel, public concerns are very high. And you have to ask, is that really about immigration, or is it about the promise of taking back control, and the obvious sense that if you've got small boats, you haven't taken back control? So there are a lot of things to dig into further. What I'd like to do now, and I'm going to come to you on this one, Tim, is run together questions from Isla Walker and Simon Eden. Simon asked really about whether the distinctions between London and the rest of England are about the nature of London as an international city, or is it really part of the sort of city, rural, small town divide that we see in lots of other areas? And Isla's questions takes it a bit further and says, is it the case that if there was real devolution within England, so that different parts of England, the major city regions or whatever structure you had, spoke more independently, maybe there would be a broader range of views within England would emerge? So, Tim, can I ask for your thoughts on that?
Yes. Yes, there is certainly that city, I don't want to say city rural, because actually the number of people who live in actually rural areas is very small. I suppose it's kind of big city versus smaller town, or kind of smaller city kind of tensions. We don't have enough data here because it only gives us London and then the north and the south and so forth. But yeah, you can certainly find that. You can certainly see it in cities like Manchester or Birmingham or Liverpool and so forth. So there is that tension. It's not just London, but London is the biggest one. And I often think one of the ways in which I like to think about London is we have to move away from thinking of London as like a city and view it as a region. It's almost a very distinct political space. It's not like Manchester, it's just much, much bigger. And if we start thinking about it in terms of being a city, it disrupts our way of analysing Manchester and Liverpool and so forth, because the sheer slight difference in size makes it very difficult to compare the two. But yes, there is certainly that city, big international city tension versus everywhere else, although that can be overplayed sometimes, especially given let me come on to the second issue about if we had more political devolution within England, would that have led to differences in views? And yes, I think you can certainly point to that. I think Henderson and Wynne-Jones touch on the fact that people in England who identify as English don't feel like they have enough control over, or they feel like they're not in control of the United Kingdom or of England or their futures and so forth. And if you think about London, it has a mayor, it's the concentration of the British political system, it has lots of boroughs that are the size of sometimes whole cities, it has most of the diplomatic representation. People in London, you could say, probably do feel like they have a bigger say, even if actually there are tensions in London about not feeling like they do have enough say, but there's certainly more political representation in London. It can sometimes be a devolution settlement that doesn't speak its name, even though the mayor is not a devolved government. It would have been interesting if there had been a Northeast Assembly, whether or not we would have seen any difference by now. But we don't have that situation yet. Could we break this down in terms of metropolitan boroughs versus kind of smaller councils across England? Again, we'd need more data, but I can certainly see why people in London might feel like they've got more power or a bigger say on things, and why that, even if it's not true, there's a certain narrative that they have more power and that they have a bigger control over the future of the UK or of London and so forth compared to everywhere else. So yes, that can certainly be a factor.
Thanks. Thanks, Tim. I'm going to pick up one, I think, directly on the data from Kieran Miko, who asks, do you see from the responses if the UK might be closer to rejoining the EU if the question was posed? I'm going to say from our data, I don't think you can draw that conclusion. The other national opinion polling suggests there's been quite a significant shift in the number of people who think it was a mistake to leave. What I think the data does show is that whatever the numerical weight of them, the divides haven't gone away. That those people who voted to leave not only think that the EU as a geopolitical entity is a much lower priority for the United Kingdom than the people who voted remain, and nor do they particularly prioritize reducing trade barriers, which is the thing you might have thought of would be the pragmatic thing you could do even if you were pleased to be outside the EU. So the overall numbers may have changed, but there's still that very polarized view between the Leave and the Remain camps about how important the EU is to us in the bigger scheme of things. Srdjan, Tim, I don't know if you want to add anything on that point.
Can I just one brief comment? I reviewed a proposal the other day from somebody who was writing on how could the UK rejoin the European Union, and part of this paper was about the political change that would need to take place, and they had not considered, and it struck me as a real big oversight still. There was no idea of having some form of England Stronger in Europe campaign. It was still Britain Stronger in Europe. The idea of talking about England in Europe was still not there, even from someone all these years after the referendum, still not wanting to talk about England in Europe and wanting to avoid that and to talk about Britain. And I immediately flagged this up to them, and well, they've gone away to think about it, but that they hadn't thought about that is telling.
Srdjan.
So much to agree here with what both of you said. In my book, I was interested in non-global foreign policy options, and so I looked at a variety of positions by British prime ministers, from Attlee to Blair. Of those, only really one came close to offering something of an alternative. So this was Ted Heath, Tory prime minister, best known for working class origins, idiosyncratic views, and declaring record 5 states of emergency. And the other person was Harry Perkins, the fictional protagonist of a novel called The Very British Coup, 1982, by the now retired Labour left politician Chris Mullin. And so, as it turns out, Chris Mullin has a sequel, sort of a second book called The Friends of Harry Perkins, and the answer in that book on the kind of Brexit reversal is a maybe. It was published in 2019, and basically picks up the original plot, takes us into the post-Brexit 2020s. The UK is grappling with countless problems. America is sending a fleet to fight China. Germany's ready, with India's support, ready to take on the UK's United Nations Security Council seat. I mean, all kinds of things are happening, and with the economy going from bad to worse, there's a kind of a grassroots attempt of the British voter. He never says English voters, but British voters are beginning to look for new options. One of which is a Brexit reversal. But I mean, it seems so far-fetched on on so many levels that I think it really belongs to political fiction at this point. But I've been wrong on Brexit before.
Thank you so much.
There.
Just to pick up a couple of quick other data points, Michael Howcraft asks about non-voters. The truth is that on this sort of fairly, shall I say, low budget YouGov survey, we aren't really able to do the sort of allowance for non-voting that YouGov would do if they were trying to predict the result of the next general election. We do know that a significant number of people who never normally voted came out and voted in the EU election, the EU referendum, and I believe that is also true of some of those for voting for the Get Brexit Done Conservative Party in 2019. So the answer is some of these issues have the ability to mobilize voters that others don't, but we don't directly answer your question. And an anonymous person said, what can we draw about England's global position on climate change? The answer, which academics will always say, this is why we need more research, because we would love to be able to extend this type of inquiry into issues around climate change, mass migration and other issues that nuclear security and so on, other issues that Tim raised. So thank you for those. Srdjan and Tim, I want to come back. One question that struck me when I looked at the data was, and maybe reading too much in it, are there reasons to look at this and wonder how strong or how fragile the pro-Ukraine coalition is in this country at the moment, which is, in terms of elite foreign policy, is absolutely unquestioned across the political spectrum. But I just wondered if you look at the focus on national defense, the relative low priority amongst all identity groups to military force being used to protect human rights and democracy, although of course some people might rightly perceive Russia as a threat to our own security if nothing happens in Ukraine. But I wondered whether there's any reason here to think that the Ukraine coalition is not as strong as some of us might want it to be. Srdjan.
Sure. So I think yes. I think you may be reading too much into the data, because I think these are the kind of questions that require a lot more surveys, maybe in a survey experimental setting. But it's a really good one, and I think we should all ask it, because the so-called, as you call it, the pro-Ukraine coalition is fighting a political battle at a time when there's so many structural problems across Western economies: the energy crisis, runaway inflation, housing and cost of living crisis, rising interest rates, rise of food banks across everywhere, crumbling infrastructure, and so on. So there are, I mean, all you need to do is simply look at what I guess the right wing of the very right-wing Republican Party in the U.S. is saying on Ukraine, and someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a MAGA Republican par excellence, just I think yesterday said not a penny more will go to Ukraine if and when we win. And you have perhaps not a strong articulation of this position elsewhere in Europe, that in continental Europe, I should say, that may be more pronounced than in the UK and Canada, but it's there right under the surface, and it might come back because of economies, stagnant economies, and also social fragmentation and political polarization that now characterizes all of our countries. So yeah, the winter will be a long one, and what comes after, I think, will be a slightly, if not very different conversation on Ukraine.
Okay, Tim.
I suppose the first thing to remind everyone is that I'm not too sure how much the public are aware of this, to be fair. The UK has been in a, shall we say, a state of conflict with Russia for quite a while, if not necessarily direct conflict, which we've got closer to through Ukraine, especially given the attacks that have taken place in the UK on Russian dissidents and so forth. So this isn't a situation that has suddenly been sprung on the UK. It's one reason why I was asked a while ago, if Boris Johnson had not been Prime Minister, do you think the UK would have taken such a forthright approach to Ukraine? And yes, I think it would, partly because the British military and intelligence services were already fully committed to this. So it doesn't come as a surprise that Britain has been very much at the forefront here, because the core of the special relationship, let's not forget, is very intelligence, nuclear weapons and special forces. And that's very much a focus with regard to right now of UK, US and Russia relations. But the second thing, I think here it comes down to what political force in the UK would be mobilized or find political gain in opposing the war in Ukraine at the moment. Because the war has created tensions for both left and right. The people on the left, who are usual criticisms of kind of British or American imperialism, suddenly find themselves having to attack, well, Russian imperialism. So it's caused dilemmas there. So it's a case of how do you oppose this war without allowing Russian imperialism? But on the right as well, this idea of suddenly turning against NATO, turning against Britain's commitment and a kind of a very strong commitment against to democracy and human rights and the free market and so forth. It's not clear where on the right this political purchase would be either. You could see maybe Nigel Farage making some play on this, but again, it'd be very difficult for them to find a way in. I think the issue in the United States is the US politics is so polarized over this that I don't know what conflict it would be other than maybe with regard to China, where this would actually become a big dividing issue. And I don't think we've reached that point in the UK yet. It may become an issue perhaps with regard to even, actually no, I was about to say on the Scottish independence referendum, but even there, perhaps if we had the polling, the Scots are not exactly opposed to supporting this country that seems to be oppressed by this larger neighboring country and so forth. There's actually it generates a degree of sympathy there. So again, I can't see the political gain for someone in the UK at the moment who could make a breakthrough to push this. And I think that's where these elite views come into play, that there's nobody who could really cash in on this at the moment. It's not clear to me who that would be.
Srdjan, let me come back to you and pose a question that's implied by what Tim said, which is about the relationship between electoral politics and what the major parties and elites do. Because I suppose one response to Tim would be, yeah, nobody thought UKIP was serious when they started. But actually, they managed to go from the point at which they could be a niche with sufficient support, firstly to persuade a major political party to concede a referendum, and then to turn what was a pro-European party into a Eurosceptic party in order to take advantage of it. From the work that you've done, not just on Britain, but elsewhere, I mean, do you have any thoughts about how these dynamics play out in an electoral system so that, provided there's sufficient space for somebody to create some sort of electoral impact, they can go further to reshape elite politics as well?
This is a really good question. I mean, we know that fringe ideas can go mainstream really fast. I mean, no one, even something like the Anglosphere was traditionally associated with essentially fringe conservative foreign policy visions in the UK, but not just in the UK. I mean, in other core Anglosphere countries as well. Most people who studied it would say, well, it was essentially steeped in images of some kind of nostalgic Englishness, where we are the buccaneer entrepreneurial peoples of a world island, right? You know, seafaring nation committed to finding partners who think just like us. So how did this happen? Well, I mean, it happens in the moments of political crisis and other types of crisis, which we identified earlier. We've been going through a period where all of the nostrums are being questioned in all of the countries that were once united under this banner, let's call it liberalism. But this liberalism is no longer hegemonic. So you asked me to kind of go beyond the UK concept. It remains the default position of mainstream politics, but there's no longer majority support. And why? Perhaps because the adoption of social, cultural, and economic liberalism has gone from coalitions between working class and middle class people as before to something completely different. Maybe something concentrated in the so-called managerial liberal elite. And I know I'm using here the right-wing language, but there's simply no way of expressing some of the points I want to make. So what you see is entrepreneurs such as Farage in the UK, but countless others elsewhere. They see there's a popular revolt against, let's call them, liberal elites, and I understand what the ironies here are, but it opens up space for political contestation at a scale that we've not seen before. And and you have a lot of competitors to this liberal default position. The Anglosphere as a concept came from what we might call one nation conservatives, mostly in home counties, London, plus places in Australia, plus in Ottawa, plus in Washington, DC, maybe a few people in New Zealand as well. And they thought, okay, well, we have so much in common in security, perhaps we should have more things in common in other areas, free trade, mobility, defense at some point as well. So that's one vision, right? But then we have other ideological competitors to liberalism. We have the radical right, whose talking points I was essentially conveying earlier. And their idea is, right-wing internationalism. So think of these, this is, again, coming from American politics, CPAC International, taking place in Budapest, Hungary, going across Asia, coming to Mexico and the Philippines, and maybe it'll come to the UK in the coming years. And there you have this vision of, okay, well, we need to play by our rules because the liberals have changed the rules so much that we no longer recognize our politics in our countries. So that's the right-wing internationalism. I have a project on this with colleagues at Ottawa and at Queen Mary. It's called Global Right. You can look it up, globalright.ca. What are their visions for international politics? Completely different from what we are used to. Fringe stuff that's now becoming more and more mainstream. And on the left, I mentioned Lexiters earlier. There's a foreign vision associated with that. I mean, it is something between some kind of old social democracy, which may no longer be possible under the conditions of the rates of profits and so on. But so some of the residual thought on what Britain or England should look like is clearly spelled out in some of these writings. They're not in mainstream newspapers, but they're online, can be accessed these very easily. And then on top of this, you have some other positions associated with left. I think Tim mentioned them earlier and quite well. I agree in his assessment. So I'll stop here. Sorry if this was not exactly the direct answer.
No, that's very useful. I'm just going to make a particular point about elites when we talk about elites here, because on other work that I've done, which is not to do with foreign policy, we've looked at the national identities and views on domestic issues like the union amongst the elites in England. And what we find is that amongst the civil service, the media, cultural influencers in the arts, culture, drama, and so on, and in the voluntary sector, they're heavily dominated by people who are British rather than English, or British more than English. So the elites actually do, in a very serious sense of the word, reflect only one part of the pattern of identity you've got here. So while we're looking at these divisions of opinion in England, you can reasonably say there is a whole chunk of people who are not equally well represented in the cultural and political decision-making of the country. I'm going to draw to an end soon, but I'd just like to read out something, if I can, which I haven't had a chance to read properly, but I think it's good, from Mary Dejewski in our Q&A, which I think will be of general interest. She says, I think there is a split between elite and other opinion on Ukraine. I do quite a few debates and argue that it's, quote, time to stop the war and talk about peace. There is what seems to me a noticeable division in the audience. when I write, usually challenging the elite consensus that we must make sacrifices so that Ukraine can be helped to win the bigger battle, suggesting the UK and other leaders are ignoring the interests of their own people, it's the same. If you probe, there is also some indignation that the public haven't been asked whether they approve of the UK sending weapons and essentially being in a war that isn't really much to do with, quote, us. I just think that's an interesting observation, and I'll probably end, if I may, on that particular point for you both to come back on. I mean, I can remember, Srdjan, you suggested yourself some surprise at the sort of narrow defense posture of quite a lot of the audience, but I couldn't quote it to you now, but I've certainly seen some ethnographic work in which voters in England very often talk about military involvement as not wanting to get involved in things that might go too far or that aren't our fight, sort of thing. So I wonder, Tim and Mary, if you could just, do you think Mary is actually onto something here when she's talking about public attitudes? Slightly different to whether they're being mobilized, but whether that public reticence isn't a real thing that we should take some account of. Srdjan, and then any further comments you've got, and then I'll go to Tim to close up.
Briefly put, I mean, this is excellent. I think that kind of really confirms one of my earlier points to be true, which is that we need more methodologically rich work on this very question. I think that's exactly right. Once you start having focus groups and ethnographies, and you get things that you could often quite easily miss through survey research, so the kind of research that I did in this book, which is, you know, very kind of high-level discourse analysis of relatively few texts, but you know, there's a similarity here with what Canadians think. They think that, you know, diplomacy should be all that we're doing, and this is strange because we need to think about institutions as well. The current budget of our global affairs department is, you know, less than $1 billion compared to the resources invested in either foreign aid, which is $5 billion, or national defense, which is something like $22 billion. And so we have to look at how some of this infrastructure is translated into foreign policy. So although allocation is imperfect indicator of government's priorities, there seems to be some support at the mass level that, you know, we should increase resources to other things, national ownership of the economy, maybe narrow understanding of defense. Also, you know, diplomacy, which in the minds of the respondent to these questions usually means peace, but there's no necessary condition there that, you know, that would lead to peace. Sorry, no, that's
again, very good. That's very good. Thank you. And Tim?
I suppose there's three things. First of all, this is something Srdjan has touched on, which is to what extent is the reaction in England that you're talking about there, John, and Mary's talking about, actually unique to England or the UK? To what extent do you find it in France, in Canada, in Denmark, and so forth? So there is always that tension of why should we get involved in this conflict far away, and what's it got to do with us? And that, I suppose, leads on to the second point for me, especially about the way that UK politics works, and which I don't see any change coming with regard to England if the UK were to break up, which is that British/English decision-making is still extremely centralized, especially on foreign policy, that the foreign policy community in the UK is tiny. It's very small. It is located in Zone 1 of London. It is very, it's filled with incredibly smart people and so forth, but it's very small, it's very limited. And there's no need under the British Constitution. It's a Crown prerogative. It belongs to the government. It's you know, the diplomatic powers of the British government's powers through the monarch to consult widely. This is something James Strong, who Srdjan mentioned earlier, has done a lot of work on at Queen Mary about the role of Parliament in this. And I can't see that changing anytime soon. And nor, and I think this is an important issue, if you go back to Henderson and Wynne-Jones' work, there's no support amongst people who identify strongly as English for any major constitutional changes in the UK. It's this very strange setup. We're not happy with the way the UK is going, the direction, but we don't want to see any radical changes to the way England is governed. Well, okay, but that includes foreign policy then. So there's no support bizarrely, sometimes amongst people who support strongly English, for any radical overhaul of the constitutional system and the oversight of foreign policy decision-making. And I suppose the final issue I'd end on here is going back to something we've touched on, which is, well, okay, how different are the views in England compared to, say, those in Scotland? To take the most obvious example, are the Scots just as uneasy about the attitude towards the conflict in Ukraine? Would people who vote Scottish National Party and want an independent Scotland, would they also hold the same view, or are they different? What similarities or differences might we find on something like Ukraine? Is this a British view, an English view? Actually, is the Scots much more isolationists than maybe even the English, maybe in future? Thanks, John.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you both. And that's a lovely point to say to people who are still on the call. That's why we have the Centre for English Identity and Politics, because there are nations, and maybe France perhaps is one, where there can be a debate about what it means to be French. The maybe perhaps unique thing in England is the extent to which our views about what our nation is actually tend very often to map onto which national identity we prioritize and which emphasis we give to it. And that's why exploring the differences between the national identities in England, whether people to lean towards their Englishness, their Britishness, or mix them both, actually does shed a light on the sort of issues that we've been talking about this evening. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Apologies to one or two people whose questions I wasn't able to take, although I think we probably touched on a lot of the questions you were raising in the other answers. I hope some of you will join us for our next event on December the 12th, also at 6 o'clock, when we'll be discussing a very different question, but asking whether we can really have an English countryside for all. And our speakers will be Tabitha Baker, Kavita Meyer, and Kate Swade. So until then, and with thanks again to our speakers, good evening.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John.